All right, everybody, here's our last little segment of notes looking at Vietnam. We'll look at the post 1968 era, and we'll start talking about how divided the country really was. All right. Understand in this whole Vietnam dispute, there were really two sides of Vietnam. You have the Hawks and the Doves. Hawks being for the war, and Doves being against war. And so you being called a Hawk, you're being called the one who wanted to go fight, and want to go throw down, want to have this thing happen. Doves being the symbol of peace, being against the war. And two sides really kind of fighting a lot, both in Congress, both in public, trying to say who's right, who's in the right in terms of what he should be doing. See a little cartoon up here, Vietnam dispute, little bombs on the eggs here. It's like well, gee, now what matters in terms of what's happening between the Hawks and the Doves. And so we say there's two sides we developed in the country. The conservative response to the anti-war movement was this phrase right here: America, love it or leave it. It was really that that response to the anti-war saying we shouldn't do this, we're doing the wrong stuff. Hey, it's America. If you don't like it, get out. And that's kind of where that scene was. And I love this picture down here. It's kind of funny. But the country was really divided. I mean, Vietnam really drove a wedge between people of where you stood on it. And it was everywhere. And so many interviews you guys are doing, hopefully you're finding that no matter where you were, it pervaded society. Really finding a generation gap. There was a big gap between the old and the young in the 60s. I mean, the gap, you think the gap today got wider, is wide? It got wider during this time. You have the World War II generation, lived through World War II, called the greatest generation as well, who are now the middle-aged, the parents, you will, and the young baby boomers born after World War II being the teenagers. And you really see this big gap in terms of thinking, in terms of values. All these things really, really start to change in the 60s. And you see that teenage group really rebel and go against the older groups. So a big generation gap happened between those two groups. Instead, Vietnam in politics is huge. With leadership, LBJ talked about before, decides not to run in 68. Nixon, on the bottom here, is a Republican candidate, promising results. You have the issues of the Democratic Convention in Chicago, where it was supposed to be a decision between Robert F. Kennedy and Hubert H. Humphrey. Obviously, RFK, Bobby Kennedy, is killed in California. And so they choose Hubert H. Humphrey, but there's a huge anti-war protest led by the Yippie group and Abby Hoffman. Here's Abby Hoffman right there in the picture. And really the anti-war protesters are, outside playing pranks and those kind of things. A lot of kids, a lot of teenagers, we're talking, young college students there in this group. And they're, beaten by police in riot gear. And this whole thing happens on TV. That's the biggest thing, that it happens on TV. And it kind of shows that whole, young kids being punks, that liberal kind of movement to it. And it really helps the more conservative Nixon win because he says, hey, we're going to promise results. We're going to help, we're leave Vietnam with honor. And, Nixon says we're going to have this honorable end to the war. We're going to fight the war, do it right. And the U.S. morale really starts sinking because it kind of questions, why are we fighting? If these things are happening back home, why are we honest to God fighting this war if that's how we feel about it here? Another event that really hit home was called the My Lai Massacre, village of My Lai in South Vietnam, where you have this guy here, Lieutenant William Cawley Jr., leading a platoon of American infantry soldiers, and they execute a group of men, women, and children in the village of My Lai in 1968. And here's the picture that's taken outside My Lai. Now, this doesn't become public knowledge until 1969 when photographs are released, and when the event happened, the U.S. government tried to cover it up. Eventually, the soldiers were put on, including Cawley here, were put on trial and were court-martialed, kicked out of the military. And actually, a U.S. pilot, a helicopter pilot, saw what was going on, stopped it, saved a lot of people. This really becomes a symbol of the war, that, soldiers were getting fed up, were getting mad, were being massacrers, I guess you will. This is where the term baby killer started coming from, as people saw these pictures of men, women, and children killed by soldiers. This did not happen often. Okay, this did not happen a lot. This was, people start thinking, well, this is all that's happening over. This is why it's bad. And that's, not the case. There are a few isolated instances where it happened. Most guys, like you heard in the talk with the Vietnam vets, are just doing their job. But this is kind of the image that Vietnam becomes of, U.S. soldiers just killing little kids, and becomes that image that is not good as guys start getting home. Now, Nixon's plan is called Vietnamization. We're going to end the war with honor. We're going to start, instead of the U.S. troops fighting, we're going to train Vietnamese troops so they can keep fighting. That way, the U.S. troops go home, and over the next few years, we'll slowly decrease the number of troops in Vietnam. If it sounds familiar, it's the same exact thing the United States does later on in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Same exact thing happens later on. But Vietnamization is Nixon's plan to get out of the war and end it with honor. So what happens, though, the war gets wider, and Nixon actually orders a bombing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Cambodia. So you have these B-2 bombers here dropping tons of bombs on Cambodia on that Ho Chi Minh Trail. So right here is a site. There are close to 2 million tons of bombs dropped in Cambodia. We're talking. So that's not just some little bombing; it's a lot of bombing that took place along where the Ho Chi Minh Trail is here. Soldiers were also sent to Cambodia, something they had to deny originally. And when this became public knowledge, it's something called the Pentagon Papers here, became public knowledge, people really started protesting. People got really mad and said, people said, we're not in Cambodia, we're not in Cambodia. We were. And it came out in the Pentagon Papers. And really showed that the U.S. government had misled or misled people about Vietnam. Led to a lot more protests. Congress actually repeals the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, says the president can't have much power. And really people start stopping to trust the government, saying, hey, the government's lying to us. Man, this ain't good. Some people have said, maybe what's happening isn't right. You see a big troop decrease, though. Okay, the number here of troops where you go from 1960, the peak here, 1968 with a Tet, and then eventually down here in 73, only 24,000 soldiers left. So it starts to lower the troop ceiling, and every single year after 68, you see the troops start going down more and more and more towards 1973. By the end, Vietnam was actually a ceasefire in 1973. So in 1973, they're talking in Paris between North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the United States, having this conversation in Paris, and they decide to have a ceasefire. Okay, no more fighting in 1973, and U.S. troops are going to leave Vietnam. That's the idea. So a ceasefire is re-signed. That ceasefire lasts until 1975. When it fails, North invades South again, and Viet Cong help North Vietnam invade South Vietnam. Eventually, Saigon, the capital, falls in 1975, and Vietnam becomes a communist country, with Saigon changing to the name Ho Chi Minh City. You see here the image of people leaving in helicopters. U.S. personnel, Vietnamese who helped the United States, are evacuated off the helicopter. We were talking we'll show you lots of pictures on this on Friday, but it's a huge deal when people are evacuated out, trying to get out of country for fear what may happen to them for helping the United States. Some of the fears that happen there. Looking at Saigon, now called Ho Chi Minh City, one of the things you see, people let people leave Vietnam. So in the Vietnamese War, which is actually called the American War, mind you, in Vietnam, 1.5 million Vietnamese were killed. And over 1 million Vietnamese leave. They're called the boat people. A lot of people just got on boats and left. Got on boats and got out of there because they're afraid what might happen to them because they helped the United States fight against the North. Helped South Vietnam and the United States fight against the North. And so they literally got on boats and they just cast it off and said, okay, we hope we'll get picked up by a U.S. ship or we'll get to another country that's not Vietnam. And some did, some didn't. But over 1 million Vietnamese relocated as refugees to the United States. You also have the Hmong population, or Laotian people, who leave out. Laos fought with the United States against North Vietnam in some cases, and a lot of them had to leave the U.S. and leave to the United States as refugees. And so first went to Thailand refugee camps, and then eventually the United States. And Southeast Asia is just extremely unstable as part of this. A lot of revolutions, and Cambodia is a big revolution, and just leave a lot of power struggles happening in Southeast Asia. Also the environmental damage, with the bombing, structural damage to the cities. Here's an area that had been napalmed or Agent Oranged. I mean, all this environmental damage, all the buildings and villages and cities that are damaged due to spraying and bombing. There's a lot of negative effect left in Vietnam. For the United States, you see things happen too. You have 56,000 U.S. soldiers dead as a part of Vietnam. So that's a big deal, okay? 300,000 that are wounded. And when guys came home, you got one or two receptions. You might see this reception here of a guy coming home to his family, or you have the idea of a lot of veterans being spit on and called baby killer, those kind of things as they got back home. A lot of times soldiers weren't being treated by the public as heroes like World War II. I mean, they may have been treated like that by their families, but it was a lot different than World War before. Psychological issues, the PTSD that people had to deal with was a big thing too. A Vietnam veteran will call it the nut bin, or psychiatric hospitals of guys who had tried ways to deal with this issues, things they saw, the stress of Vietnam. Some guys turn to drugs and alcohol. Some guys get help. Some guys don't at all. Keep it all bottled up inside, as we talked about in class. And so that's one of our problems here. You also have Agent Orange and health effects. Here's people in Vietnam, kids that were born due to some health effects because of Agent Orange, cancer, those kind of things are a big deal. And also U.S. vets who are kind of allying with Vietnam about Agent Orange and health effects, so because of cancer and those kind of things that were spread because of the chemicals used during Vietnam. Some other things we see happening in the United States is that we see the 26th Amendment passed. Now, this lowers the voting age to 18. Before 26th Amendment is passed, the voting age is 21. There's a big deal for this, okay? Big deal here is that you're 21, you can go to Vietnam and fight, but you couldn't vote. And they said that's not exactly right. So it actually lowers the voting age to 18 as part of that. You also see the draft ended in 1973. Now the Army is all volunteer. If you join the Army, you're a volunteer. You make sure that you work, you volunteer to go, you sign up to go, versus being called, have the draft happen. Now, could the draft be brought back? Yes, it could. I had to register for the draft. Everyone male is registered to turn 18 as well. But the draft is not just there to be used; it has to be brought back with the act of Congress. You also see a change of fighting too. Vietnam was fought as a limited war. Okay, it wasn't like an overwhelming force kind of thing. It was, you can't push too hard. Like the one guy said, you have to ask permission to fight back sometimes. It's definitely changed to what we call now overwhelming force. In Iraq, it was the term shock and awe was used. Is that overwhelming force, get in, get it done with, get over with, not let it drag out. That was the idea. Was what's supposed to be happening with things, in Iraq and Afghanistan. Last thing is something called the War Powers Act that got passed. This is kind of one of the things that was, as Gulf of Tonkin was being repealed. Just note that Congress made that President has to report to Congress that they're deploying troops, and that the President can't send troops to a place for more than 90 days without Congress's approval. And so right now, President Obama can send troops anywhere he wants to. He's commander in chief, but he has to let Congress know he's doing it and say, "Hey, I'm doing this. You guys know." He also has to make sure he has, if they're there for more than 90 days, he has to have the approval of Congress, which has happened in like Iraq and Afghanistan, those kind of places, but that needs to happen that way. So what issues you see here at home? A lot of distrust of the government. People are saying, the idea that, we were winning. Now we're not. Now this and that. We're never getting the real message. And people started not trusting the government because of that. That was a big issue. I mean, it was a really, really big issue in terms of trust. So with Cambodia, Pentagon Papers, Miley cover-ups, people kind of said, can I trust government? And it really came out during Vietnam. A lot of wounds that got made that way. PTSD, a lot of wounded veterans, disabled veterans have help. In the 80s, there's a lot of problems for veterans with alcoholism, homelessness, those kind of things after the war was done, and trying to get help for people who need it. You see the pictures here from the internet about, homeless veterans that need help. So there's a lot of issues that, people use the Veterans Administration, VA hospitals get help, some do, some don't. A lot of problems with homeless veterans, not being able to find jobs, those kind of things after the war is done. The whole debate comes up again of, is America sticking those in places we don't need to stick them? Are there problems that things need to take care of? And so, that's another thing comes out too. In 1973, prisoners of war. So some guys have been prisoners of war until 1973 when all the prisoners finally came home. Some didn't come home. And there's still some people who are considered to be missing yet in Vietnam. You have some people with the POW MIA, to the flag right here. Some POWs never made it back. Some people are still considered missing in Vietnam, either missing, declared dead, or still declared missing, that their families don't know what happened to the guys, whether they crashed or were caught somewhere, where it might be, during Vietnam. People aren't sure. And then finally, you have the memorial, the idea of the memorial wall here to the Vietnam veterans, the names on the wall. And we'll look at an example of the wall in class a little bit too, and kind of see what it looks like and how there's a way to change guys that are missing on there to being found. That's never actually ever happened. The only way the change happened to the wall is that the wall has been changed from missing in action to killed in action. It's never actually been changed from, missing in action to found. And so we see that memorial for the wall there. Big debated question is, who won? Honestly, I can't tell you. Most believe the U.S. fought to a stalemate. Others feel they lost. Some feel that the United States, with more time, more resources, could have won. That's the kind of big debate that comes to Vietnam. So there you go. Who knows? We won or not. We'll talk about it in class. Thanks a lot, guys, and we'll see you later.